A.C. Grayling is Professor of Philosophy at Birkbeck College at the University of London and the author of numerous books, including his latest, Thinking of Answers. His area of expertise is scepticism, but he's no ivory tower academic, contributing regularly to debate in the mainstream media. He's here in Australia to participate in the Global Atheist Convention in Melbourne during March. A.C. Grayling, thanks for speaking with us. Now, I believe you understand, or you prefer, the term naturalist to atheist. I take it that's not about nude sunbathing. What's the distinction that you make there?
Well, as a matter of fact, because of the confusion between naturists and naturalists, I'm beginning to think that we might go back to the old phrase, which is free thinker. Right. And that might be better, because also it has the implication as well that you're free to consider all viewpoints and think about the grounds that people might have for holding those viewpoints. And this is probably a better label. But I use the term naturalist because it has the implication that your view about the world is based, to your best ability anyway, on our understanding of the natural world and natural law.
Okay. What is a free thinker free from? That's difficult to say.
Well, free from inherited traditional ways of thinking about the world. All the major religions of the world, despite the fact that they are, in genuine historical terms, looking at human history, very young religions, so Judaism, Christianity, Islam, even Hinduism, relatively speaking, very young religions. Nevertheless, they've become deeply imbued into the traditions of civilization all around the world. And for that reason, when people go to school, or when they're taught by their parents, when they go to church, what they inherit is this way of thinking about the world. And what a free thinker would be free of is that set of assumptions, that framework, that pair of spectacles that makes them see the world a certain way.
Now, you obviously feel it's possible to be a free thinker and to remove yourself from that framework. Does this link back to your own philosophical work?
It does, yes, because what it involves, although it's not always and at every point easy to do this, but it involves a kind of critical reflection on the assumptions, on the methods that you use, on the nature of the commitments in question, the beliefs and the grounds on which they're held. And it is possible, because we are, after all, reflective and intelligent primates, for us to examine the scaffolding on which our view of the world rests. And once we do this, and do it in a very critical way, through discussion, through examination of different theories, competing theories, through our best understanding of how our minds work and how the world works, we can start to get some sense of the respects in which these traditions are partial in the literal sense of that term. That is, that they come at things from a particular point of view based on a particular set of commitments.
One of your areas of philosophical work is scepticism, but you're not a skeptic in the sense that philosophers would use it. Can you explain for the non-philosophers what you mean by scepticism?
Yeah, well, there are two, broadly speaking, different senses of scepticism. One is this rather healthy sense in which you always examine the grounds that people have for making certain sorts of claims, that you look at the evidence that they can advance in support of them and try to evaluate them and assess them according to your best and most intellectually honest lights. So that's a healthy kind of skepticism. But then there's the kind of skepticism which makes claims to the effect that we simply can't have knowledge in certain domains, so that we can't really have mathematical knowledge or ethical knowledge or knowledge about the material world or knowledge about religious claims. And there the challenge is to look at the skeptical arguments that are put against the possibility of knowledge and to see on what basis you could try to build the structure of knowledge.
Am I right that your view is that most philosophers who do that fall short, that scepticism does not hold up under scrutiny?
No, epistemological scepticism, which is what I'm talking about there, doesn't really hold up for all sorts of reasons, and some of them are rather technical, some of them are very simply stateable. I mean, for example, if somebody claimed that we don't know anything, then trivially we don't know that we don't know anything, and so it seems a rather self-defeating position. But much more interestingly, what traditional philosophical skepticism does, it says, look, for all sorts of reasons to do with the nature of rationality and with psychological contingencies about how we perceive, how we think, how we remember, we're always at risk of error, of failing in justifying our judgments properly. And that's the interesting thing to look at, because in fact we do make very successful use of the world around us and we manage to navigate through it more or less reasonably. How is that happening? And so to look at that gives us a way of responding to the skeptic's challenge.
So some sort of real knowledge is possible. Obviously for you, you've come to a position, naturalism. Have you always been a naturalist? Or how did you get to that point?
Well, firstly, I wasn't. I was brought up in a home that wasn't at all religious. It was not observant, and my parents had themselves emerged out of I suppose, a kind of Church of England, Anglican kind of background, but without themselves being very religious. And I certainly wasn't. But I went to a boarding school where we had to go to chapel every day, and that's guaranteed not to make people religious, of course. We spent all our time flicking ink pellets at one another, until one day a new chaplain read a rather familiar prayer in Matins, "O Lord, open thou our hearts, by the inspiration of thy Holy Spirit." And the way he said it, he said, "Inspiration of thy Holy Spirit," a bit kind of revivalist, you know. And it made me prick up my ears, because not long before I'd been reading about the Greek conception of inspiration, of how the muses breathed in the poetry or the insights or something of the great people like Homer and Hesiod and the rest. And I went up to him and I said, "Give me some stuff to read," which he did. Actually, really rather interesting reading list, which included Dostoevsky. It was, you know, pretty ambitious for a 14-year-old schoolboy. Bishop Robinson, honest to God, said, "You must read the Epistle to the Romans. It's a great converting epistle." And I spent a whole school holiday studying all this stuff very carefully. And I went back to school and I went to see him. And I said to him, "I've read everything you've asked me to read, and I've got a question for you. And the question is, how can you believe it?" And he said, "Every morning when I wake up, I pray, 'O Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief.'" And I said, "You don't believe it either." I've come to the conclusion, by the way, that a lot of, at least Church of England clergymen, don't really believe it, but they see themselves as a very useful kind of addition to the social welfare services.
Right. You felt, obviously, that he was, in a sense, faking his commitment.
No, I think that there are lots of reasons why people commit themselves to a religious outlook. And the basic reasons are non-rational ones. There are rational claims made about why people believe, why they commit themselves to a particular religion, but they very often have a kind of post facto, you know, posterior justification feel about them. The non-rational doesn't necessarily mean irrational, but it denotes emotional commitment or a return to something that felt very good and secure in childhood or something. I mean, I do take the view that the religions would be much less forceful in the world at large if children weren't educated into them.
Because it's certainly true that most people do come to religious faith in their sort of adolescent periods. That's the point at which people change their worldviews.
Yeah, but they have to have been exposed to a lot of adult reinforcement and social reinforcement of certain beliefs. I mean, they believe in Father Christmas, so they also believe in God, and the social reinforcement of the Father Christmas story doesn't continue after a certain age, but the God story does. I mean, it's all around us in churches and radio programs. And
is it your view that unbelief would do the same thing for children? If there are atheist camps for children, that they will end up as atheists?
Well, as you know, the atheist camp movement has now started in the United States, Camp Quest, where children are asked to find the unicorns, the invisible unicorns in the camp, and so on. I'm pretty sure that in those societies, like, for example, the Chinese society, which is not a religious society, it's a superstitious one. Of course, there are Christians and Falun Gong and others in China, but generally speaking and traditionally, it's not a religious society. As I say, it does have superstitions. But the major dominating influences in Chinese thought have been philosophies as opposed to religions. So Buddhism, in its original form, of course, it's accreted a lot of superstitious elements, but in its original form, it has no deity or deities, it has no supernatural elements.
The Buddha denied that he was a god, yes.
Indeed. And Confucianism is also a philosophy. And so the educated people throughout the Chinese tradition have been brought up in one or other of those philosophies. And because they haven't been exposed to what we would regard as traditional characteristic religious beliefs, they just don't have them. It's a very good example of how education makes a difference in these respects.
They are an interesting case because, of course, Christianity is on the rise in China in a way it's not in many other places around the world, particularly Europe. Is there some explanation for that in a naturalist sense?
What explains what's happening in China is allied rather closely to what's happening elsewhere in the world, not in growth of numbers elsewhere in the world, but in increase of volume in the degree to which people are prepared to avow their faith or take a stand, now that we've got this division opening up between the religious and the non-religious. And that is that when anything is under pressure, any ideology is under pressure, as the Chinese communist ideology is, it opens a gap into which people fall if they don't have something else to clutch onto. And people do have a propensity to look for the ready-made, the ready-to-hand set of answers. And it's one reason why, for example, people recur to the religious belief